The chandeliers above the ballroom cast a warm glow over polished floors, the kind of light that makes everything look like it belongs in a magazine. Laughter spilled across the room like champagne, and the country club in Charleston smelled faintly of roses, bourbon, and expensive perfume. My stepfather, Henry Moreland, stood at the center of it all, raising his glass, dressed in his perfectly tailored navy suit. He looked like a man who owned the world, or at least believed he did. Guests leaned toward him the way people lean toward power. I was standing off to the side in a pale dress I never really liked, clutching the stem of a glass I had barely touched. It was his 70th birthday, a milestone night for the patriarch of one of Charleston's oldest and wealthiest families. My name is Juliet Moreland, and until that night I thought humiliation had a limit. I was wrong. I had grown up in this world of manicured gardens, antique silver, and country club whispers. For most of my life, I tried to blend in quietly. I restored paintings for museums, not because I wanted to be invisible, but because it was safer to be quiet in a house where speaking too loudly invited punishment. Henry always made sure I remembered my place. He was not my real father, but he loved to remind me that he owned every part of the life I was allowed to touch. That night began with a speech. It was supposed to be a tribute, one of those grand, sentimental gestures that rich families turn into performances. He stood on the stage with a microphone in hand, surrounded by golden drapes, and the orchestra softened behind him. At first, it was polite. He thanked the guests for their loyalty, told a few jokes made people smile. Then, in the middle of that polished moment, he turned his gaze toward me. The room stilled almost imperceptibly. I felt it in the tightening of the air. He smiled in a way I had learned to fear, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. He said my name slowly, as if it tasted bitter. Juliet. He told the crowd that every great family must learn to prune weak branches. His voice was smooth and sharp like a blade. People shifted in their chairs, not sure whether to laugh or stay still. He walked toward me, still holding the microphone, still smiling. He said I had disappointed him, that I had embarrassed the Moreland name by refusing to join the family business, that I had chosen a life of dusty paintings instead of legacy. He called me a burden dressed in silk. The orchestra stopped. Cameras lifted. Some of the guests leaned forward as if they did not want to miss the spectacle. I tried to speak just a small plea, a quiet Henry please, but he did not let me finish. He set the microphone down. He stepped closer, and I smelled the scotch on his breath. His hand came across my face with a sound that cut through the room like glass shattering. In that instant, the ballroom froze. My vision blurred not just from the sting, but from the weight of hundreds of eyes watching me. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered. I could see flashes from phones. This was not private anymore. This was public execution. He leaned down, his voice low but perfectly clear. You are no longer part of my family. I am cutting you out of the $230 million will. The number rang out like a headline. The guests looked at each other. Some smiled nervously. Some filmed. No one stepped forward. My mother Vivian was standing near the stage in her emerald gown, the perfect image of Southern grace. She did not move. Her hands trembled against her clutch, but her eyes stayed on the floor. My stepbrother Chad leaned against a pillar, watching the faintest trace of satisfaction curling at his mouth. My cheeks burned not just from the strike, but from the realization that everyone there was content to be a spectator. The weight of it pushed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had lived under Henry's control my entire life, but that moment carved the line between quiet suffering and public ruin. I tasted the metallic tang of blood on my lip and straightened my spine. I walked past him, past the orchestra, past rows of silent faces in designer gowns and tuxedos. The night air hit me as I pushed through the heavy doors of the ballroom. Snow had started falling over Charleston, rare and almost beautiful, but my skin burned where his hand had struck. My heels clicked on the marble steps as flashes behind me continued, someone still recording, as if my humiliation was a show they could take home. I stood alone under the soft flakes mascara running down my cheeks, my breath sharp in the cold air. The laughter inside drifted out faintly, the sound of a world that had turned its back on me. That slap was not just a moment of violence. It was decades of control condensed into one brutal act. I thought I was numb. I was not. I felt the cut of betrayal in my chest. I felt the crushing silence where love should have been. That night, I thought I lost everything, but I did not know that the man who stood inside with a glass of scotch in his hand was not my father at all. He was something else entirely. And the world I had believed in for 36 years was already beginning to crack. The night after the party, I sat on the cold hardwood floor of my apartment still wearing the dress from the gala, its silk torn slightly at the shoulder. I had not turned on the lights. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. The city outside was wrapped in winter silence, and Charleston's streets below were nearly empty. My phone was the only thing alive, buzzing every few seconds like a heartbeat I no longer trusted. I had not cried at the party. I had walked out too stunned to even breathe properly. But now the weight of it was starting to settle. I opened the screen without meaning to, and there it was. A video taken from the back of the ballroom, shaky but clear enough. Henry's hand crossing my face. The sound of the slap echoed through the microphone. The crowd freezing. My mother standing still. Chad smirking. The moment he declared I was cut from the $230 million will. The entire spectacle in 20 seconds. I scrolled down and saw thousands of comments flooding under the clip. It had already been shared across platforms and local news sites were reposting it. People were arguing in the comments like it was a public trial. Some called it disgusting. Others said it was family business. A few tried to justify him because wealth tends to make people blind. I dropped the phone. It landed with a soft thud, but the buzzing continued. It felt like the whole world was watching the worst moment of my life and treating it like entertainment. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The bruise was forming across my cheekbone, a dark bloom, spreading under the pale skin. The lipstick had faded. The mascara had left black trails down my face. I looked like someone else entirely. Not the silent woman who kept her head down during family functions. Not the daughter who smiled politely to keep the peace. I looked like a woman cracked open in public. I splashed cold water on my face, but the mark stayed. It would stay for days. I walked back into the living room and slumped against the wall. The hum of the city outside was faint now, but every vibration from my phone felt louder. I finally picked it up again and saw dozens of messages from people I had not heard from in years. Some were polite. Some were fake sympathy. A few were reporters pretending to be friends. One message came from a college acquaintance asking if it was real. Another from an old colleague asking for an interview. My hands shook as I set the phone down again. I had spent years avoiding family drama in public, keeping my head down to stay invisible. And now invisibility was gone. It was out there, framed and shared, and I could not pull it back. I wrapped my arms around my knees, listening to the quiet. My mind kept replaying the moment on the ballroom floor like a film loop. His hand. My mother frozen. Chad watching. The crowd doing nothing. Not a single person had stepped forward. Not one. In a different house, in a different life, someone might have cared. But in Henry's world, money was a language that silenced everyone. I felt the edges of anger pressing through the fog of humiliation. For years, I had let myself believe silence would protect me. It never had. It only built walls around me that Henry could close whenever he wanted. The phone rang this time, not just buzzed. I saw the name flash across the screen. Vivian, my mother. I answered without knowing why. She spoke before I could say a word. Her voice was soft, controlled, almost rehearsed. She told me not to escalate. She said things like family image and legacy. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not even use my name. I heard the sound of glasses clinking in the background as if the party had never ended. I hung up without responding. For the first time in my life, I felt absolutely alone. Not the kind of alone that comes from an empty room, but the kind that sinks deep into the bones. I turned off all the lights except for the small lamp by the window and sat down at the kitchen counter. Outside, the snow was still falling in soft flurries. Charleston rarely saw snow, but tonight the streets were lined with a thin white sheet. It made everything look clean, which was a lie. Nothing was clean anymore. I opened my laptop and saw the headline already spreading. Billionaire real estate mogul Henry Moreland slaps stepdaughter at gala. It was everywhere. News anchors were talking about the will. Commentators were dissecting my life. They did not know me, but they spoke as if they owned the truth. I shut the laptop with a soft click. My hands felt cold even though the heat was on. The bruise on my cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. For a moment, I closed my eyes and remembered being 12 years old, standing in the same ballroom, too afraid to speak when Henry scolded me for spilling water on a tablecloth. Back then, I had believed if I behaved perfectly, he would leave me alone. I had been wrong. The silence had never been protection. It had been permission. I opened my eyes again. My reflection stared back from the darkened window. This was the first night in 36 years where I saw it clearly. The man who humiliated me had always controlled me. The people who could have spoken never did. I was not part of his family anymore. In truth, maybe I never had been. My phone buzzed one last time. I turned it face down and let it go unanswered. The snow kept falling. The city lights blurred in the distance. The silence was no longer gentle. It was sharp. It cut through me and left me standing on the edge of something I could not yet name. But I knew one thing with an unfamiliar certainty. That night had broken something, but it had also opened a door I did not even know existed. I had lived quietly for too long. I would not be quiet again. The knock came at 8 in the morning, steady and deliberate, like the kind of knock that belongs to people who already know what they want. My head ached from the night before, the kind of dull ache that sits behind your eyes and hums with every heartbeat. The apartment was still dark. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV off and the phone still face down on the floor. At first, I thought it was some persistent reporter who had tracked my address overnight. That was the new reality now. My humiliation was trending, and strangers knew my face. The knocking came again. 3 measured taps. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and moved toward the door slowly. My building was quiet. The air in the hallway felt sharp against my skin. When I opened the door just a few inches, I did not see a reporter. I saw 3 people in dark coats, their shoes spotless, their posture straight. They did not look like they belonged in Charleston's worn old brick apartments. They looked like they had stepped straight out of a courtroom drama. The woman in front spoke first. Her voice was calm, almost disarmingly gentle. "Miss Moreland," she said. My name hung in the air. "May we come in?" For a second, I thought about slamming the door, but something about her eyes stopped me. They did not hold pity or judgment. They held purpose. I pulled the door wider. The trio stepped inside like they belonged there. The woman introduced herself as Judith Blackwell, senior partner at Blackwell and Hartman, LLP, New York. She gestured toward the 2 men with her. "These are Mr. Chin and Mr. Reeves. We represent your biological father." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. They rippled through the quiet, through the ache in my head, through 36 years of what I thought was my life. I almost laughed, but no sound came out. My voice felt stuck somewhere in my throat. "Excuse me. Biological father. That has to be a mistake." Judith did not blink. She opened a leather folder and laid a business card on the counter. "This conversation is not one for a hallway." The coffee pot on the counter was still cold. My hands trembled as I gestured toward the table. They sat down with a kind of quiet coordination that made me feel small in my own kitchen. I stayed standing, clutching the blanket tighter around me. Judith folded her hands. "I know this is unexpected," she said, "but it is not a mistake." I shook my head. "I have a father. You might have seen him on the news last night." Her eyes did not change. "We know about Henry Moreland, but he is not your father. We have documentation, police records, and a federal case file." The room seemed to tilt. For a second I thought it was lack of sleep. She continued. "Last night, after the incident at the country club went viral, a volunteer with the Missing Children Foundation saw the clip online. They recognized the bracelet you were wearing. It matched the description in an active missing child case from 1997. That tip was forwarded to the FBI. The file was flagged. DNA records confirmed the likelihood. That is why we are here. They had just connected me to a ghost." I looked down at my wrist. The silver bracelet I had worn since childhood caught the gray morning light. I remembered Henry telling me it had been passed down for generations. I had believed him. I always believed him. I took a step back until my shoulder hit the wall. My breath felt shallow, sharp against my ribs. Judith slid the folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of documents that looked older than the life I thought I knew. Police reports from New York. A grainy photograph of a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. The bracelet on her tiny wrist gleamed in the black and white image. My name, or rather the name that had been erased from me, was printed at the top of one page. Lila Archer. I stared at it like it belonged to someone else. This has to be a mistake. I kept saying it in my head, but the words never made it out. Judith's voice was calm, precise. In 1997, a child named Lila Archer was taken from Central Park while her nanny was distracted. A woman matching Vivian Moreland's age and description was identified as a person of interest. The investigation stalled when the adoption records surfaced from Mexico heavily falsified. You were 6 years old. I pressed my hand against the counter because the floor felt unsteady. She went on. Your biological father has been searching for you for 28 years. The FBI reopened the case 3 months ago after a new DNA database flagged a match from a genealogy test you took at the university years back. Last night, the video was the final piece that confirmed it. The name you have lived with is not the one you were born with. I heard the sound of my breathing too loud in the silence. I had taken that test for fun. My friends had convinced me. I never thought it mattered. But now it was unraveling everything. Henry's hand, his voice, the years of control, the locked rooms, the expectations. None of it was fatherhood. It was ownership built on a lie. Mr. Chen opened another folder and gently placed a birth certificate on the table. I saw my birth date, my real name, my real father's signature. Judith said softly. He never stopped looking. He is in New York now. He asked us to contact you in person. There was a time when words like that would have sounded like a fairy tale. A father who never gave up. A family I did not know. But it did not feel like a fairy tale now. It felt like an earthquake. I sank into the chair opposite them because standing felt impossible. Judith leaned forward slightly. I know this is overwhelming. We can take it one step at a time. I tried to find my voice. Why now? Why after all these years? She answered without hesitation. Because last night made you visible again. It gave someone who remembered you a reason to call. The volunteer recognized the bracelet because they had been part of the original search. They never forgot your face. My fingers brushed the bracelet. For 36 years, I had thought it meant family. It did, just not his. Outside my window, the snow had not yet melted. The city looked clean and calm in the morning light, but everything inside me was shifting. Judith's tone softened. We can arrange a meeting with your father when you are ready. He has waited a long time. Her words carried no pressure, but they settled heavy in the room. I thought of Vivian's voice last night, cold and distant. I thought of Henry's hand, the way it struck not just my face, but the foundation of everything I believed about my life. I thought of the people who filmed, and the people who stayed silent. My world had already cracked. Now it was opening. I closed the folder, slowly feeling the paper edges against my skin. I could not change the past, but the past had finally found me. Judith stood smoothing her coat. We will leave you time to process this, she said. Mr. Reeves placed a card on the counter. If you have questions, day or night. Then they left as quietly as they had come. The apartment door clicked shut. I sat alone with the folder in front of me. The name Lila Archer stared back. I traced the bracelet with my thumb. For 36 years, I had lived inside a story built by someone else. This was the moment I realized it was never mine to begin with. The knock had not just opened a door. It had torn a hole through the walls of my life, and something deep inside me whispered that I would never be able to close it again. The next afternoon, the wind off the harbor carried a damp chill as I walked toward the law office. The building was an old brick structure with polished brass handles on the door and windows that reflected the gray sky. The world outside still felt unreal. It had only been a single day since the knock on my door, but time had slowed into something heavy. Inside the office smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Judith was waiting at the front, her hair pulled neatly back, her tone steady in a way that made the air seem more solid. She guided me into a private conference room with a long wooden table. A folder sat in the center like a quiet bomb. I sat down slowly, pulling the chair close to the table as if the ground might shift beneath me. Judith took the seat across from me and placed her hands on the folder. She did not rush. "Miss Moreland," she began, "what I am about to show you is the full case record." The moment she opened the folder, the sound of paper sliding against paper felt deafening. The first thing I saw was a black and white photograph. A baby in a yellow blanket, dark hair, eyes half open, a small silver bracelet glinting on the wrist. My bracelet. My breath caught somewhere in my chest. It was strange seeing yourself without remembering being that person. Judith laid out documents one after another. A birth certificate with the name Lila Eleanor Archer. A police report from 1997 stating missing child Central Park. I scanned the lines, but the words blurred into a hum. There were signatures from officers, long retired descriptions of a woman seen near the park, reports of a nanny distracted by a question about directions. It was a story I had never heard, but it was written with my name at the center. Judith explained each piece carefully. The nanny had been paid to look away. The paperwork from Mexico had been falsified. Henry had used a network that operated quietly for years before disappearing. My body felt cold despite the heating in the room. I ran my thumb over the corner of the photograph again and again. This baby had been loved by someone. This baby had been stolen. My hands shook slightly. Judith's voice softened. "Your father never stopped searching. He hired private investigators. He kept the case alive when most would have given up. It never left the missing children database. And last night someone recognized what they never forgot." I stared at the stack of paper like it might rewrite my entire existence. For 36 years, Henry Moreland had been the man I feared. Now every moment of that life carried a different weight. The control, the coldness, the way he always looked at me like I was an outsider wearing a borrowed name. I pressed my palms against my temples. I did not want to cry. I wanted to breathe. Judith's hand hovered over the table, but she did not touch me. She simply waited. I forced myself to look at the birth certificate again. My real name written in faded ink. My father's signature. A name I had never spoken. James Archer. The letters felt foreign on my tongue even in silence. I remembered being 7 years old asking Henry why I did not look like anyone else in the family. He had smiled without warmth and told me I was special. I had believed him because believing him was safer than asking again. Memory began to crawl back like light under a door. I saw flashes of moments I had buried without realizing. The way Vivian sometimes went quiet at night when Henry spoke too loudly. A night when I was 10, she had come into my room, sat at the edge of the bed, and opened her mouth to say something. Then Henry's voice from the hallway had sliced through the quiet, and she had closed it again. I had not thought about that moment in years, but now it rose up sharp and clear. Judith noticed the change in my face. "Flashbacks," she said gently. "It is normal." I nodded, but words were still difficult. I thought about Vivian's hands trembling at the party, not with courage but with fear. I realized she had been living in his shadow too, though her silence had cost me everything. I picked up the photo again and stared at the bracelet on the tiny wrist. It was identical to the one I wore now, though mine was dulled with age. I rubbed my thumb over the metal and felt the grooves of the engraving. A train engine. A child's charm. Henry had told me it came from his family. That was a lie too. Judith's voice lowered. The moment the volunteers saw that bracelet in the video, they called the hotline. They had kept your missing poster on their desk all these years. It was enough to reopen everything. I exhaled slowly, feeling the room close in around me. I asked her how Vivian fit into all of this. Judith paused, choosing her words with care. "Your mother's involvement was documented. She traveled to Mexico with Henry at the time the falsified adoption was processed. We believe she was manipulated, but she signed the paperwork." That line burned. I imagined her standing in some office years ago signing the papers that would erase my name. Yet I could still see her face when she used to brush my hair at night when I was a child. it was not simple. It was never simple. My throat tightened. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, the street was empty, except for a man walking his dog, unaware that my entire world was unraveling a few feet away. Judith reached into the folder again and brought out a sealed envelope. Inside was a recent photograph of James Archer, silver hair, kind eyes, standing in front of a brick townhouse in New York. He looked like someone solid, someone who did not belong in the shadows of lies. He is alive. He has been waiting for this moment for a very long time, Judith said. She slid the photo toward me but did not push. I picked it up carefully. It felt heavier than paper should. I thought about Henry's world built on control and secrets, and then I thought about this man who had spent nearly 3 decades searching for a girl who no longer remembered his face. My fingers curled around the photograph. My voice came out barely above a whisper. The man who raised me was not my father. Judith met my gaze. "No," she said. "He was the man who took you." The words hung in the room like smoke. For years I had endured his rules, his cruelty, his public humiliation, believing it was something like family. It had never been family. It had been captivity wearing a polished mask. I stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table. The photograph of the baby, the documents, the police reports. They were all pieces of a life that had been stolen before I could even understand it. The world outside the window felt distant and quiet. I whispered the words more to myself than anyone else. The man who hit me wasn't my father. He was my kidnapper. The room stayed still after that. Even the sound of the city outside seemed to hold its breath. Something inside me shifted, not like a break, but like a door finally opening after years locked shut. And I knew nothing about my life would ever look the same again. The city outside the window of the cab was washed in gray. New York in winter felt louder than Charleston ever did. Horns cut through the air. Steam rose from the grates along the street. People moved with the hurried rhythm of a place that never learned how to slow down. My hands were clenched in my lap. As the cab turned onto Fifth Avenue, the weight of the last 48 hours pressing against my ribs. The Plaza Hotel came into view, its cream-colored facade like something out of an old photograph. I had spent most of my life looking at places like this from a distance. Now I was walking into one. Judith met me in the lobby. She was wearing the same calm expression she had the day she delivered the news, as if her steady presence could hold the world together when mine was spinning apart. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I was not, but I nodded anyway. The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of cables. When the doors opened, a suite waited at the end of the hallway. She paused at the door. "He is just inside." I took a slow breath and pushed the door open. The man standing near the window was tall with silver streaks in his dark hair and a stillness that felt different from Henry's heavy presence. His posture was straight, but his hands were shaking slightly at his sides. He turned when the door clicked shut. The first thing I noticed were his eyes. They were green, the same shade as mine. He did not rush toward me. He just whispered one word. "Lila." Hearing that name out loud for the first time in my adult life felt like a wave breaking against the inside of my chest. I could not speak. He took a small step forward, voice rough around the edges. "You still wear it." His eyes dropped to my wrist. I followed his gaze to the bracelet. I had worn it for 36 years without knowing whose it really was. He took another step. The air between us felt tight, stretched like a wire that could snap or hold everything together. I managed a whisper. "You gave me this." His mouth trembled slightly as he nodded. "Your mother picked it out. She said it sounded like trains and you loved trains." The mention of her mother, the one I had never met, cracked something inside me. For a second, the noise of the city below disappeared. There was only the sound of my breath and the echo of a life I should have known. He did not reach for me. He waited, and I did not realize I was moving until I was standing in front of him close enough to see the tears that had gathered in the corners of his eyes. When his arms wrapped around me, I felt something I had not felt since I was a child. Safety without fear. Warmth without control. I pressed my forehead against his chest, and for the first time in years I let myself cry. Not the sharp, silent tears I had learned to hide, but the deep ones that shook through the entire body. He held me with a gentleness I did not know how to accept, but could not pull away from. When we finally stepped apart, he wiped at his face quickly the way men do when they have held too much in for too long. "Your mother would have loved to see you," he said softly. "She passed 5 years ago, but she never stopped believing." The words slid into me like a blade made of memory. She was gone. A woman who had loved me was gone, and I never even knew her face. I asked him quietly, "Did she really keep searching?" His smile was full of grief and pride. "Every year, every single year. She left letters for you. She kept your room the same. She believed you would come home." We left the hotel together and took a black car across the city. The Upper East Side felt like a different world entirely, lined with brownstones and iron railings, and quiet streets muffled by snow. His house stood at the end of the block, a tall brick structure with ivy creeping across the facade, frozen in the winter air. When he opened the door, the smell of cedar and something faintly floral rushed out, the kind of scent that belongs to a place lived in for a long time. I followed him down a hallway lined with photographs. There were pictures of him and a woman with soft eyes laughing in a park. There was a baby in a yellow blanket. Me. I stopped walking. He looked back but did not say anything. He let me take it in, piece by piece. At the end of the hall, he opened a white door with a brass handle. Inside was a room frozen in time. The walls were still painted a soft shade of yellow. A small wooden bed stood in the corner with a faded quilt. Shelves lined with children's books sat against the wall, their spines cracked with age. A train mobile hung above the bed, its paint chipped but still bright. My knees felt weak. He walked over to a small wooden chest near the window and knelt down. He opened the lid slowly and pulled out a small stack of envelopes tied together with a thin blue ribbon. "Your mother wrote one every year on your birthday. She said if you ever came home, she wanted you to know she never stopped waiting." He held out the letters. My hands shook as I took them. The top one was dated the year after I disappeared. The ink was slightly faded, but the writing was careful and elegant. "My sweet girl, if you find this, know we never stopped looking. Know you are loved." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. He rested a hand lightly on my shoulder, not claiming just steady. We sat on the floor of that room together, surrounded by the pieces of a childhood I never had. He told me how they searched through the years, how the police eventually stopped calling, how he hired investigators, how my mother refused to let anyone touch this room. She said if you walked through that door someday, she wanted it to be waiting. I stared at the train mobile as it turned slowly from the draft coming through the window. It was the kind of detail no one would invent. It was love etched into wood and paint and time. I felt the weight of Henry's house pressing against the memory of this one. In his house, everything had been cold marble and silence. In this one, everything spoke even after years of waiting. He told me she had died of cancer, that she had kept a photo of me by her bed until the end. My voice broke when I asked if she suffered much. He closed his eyes and nodded. "She always believed you were alive," he whispered. I clutched the stack of letters to my chest. The grief was sharp, but beneath it was something else, a strange, quiet warmth I could not name. I walked over to the small bed and sat down carefully, as if I might break the moment if I moved too quickly. I stared at the window where faint snowflakes drifted past. This room had been waiting for me for 28 years. I whispered the words under my breath. I wasn't lost. I was stolen. And for the first time, saying it out loud did not feel like the world was collapsing. It felt like the beginning of something real. The day I walked into the federal building in Boston, the air felt colder than it had in New York. The streets outside were wet from melting snow, and the lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. 2 agents met me at the security desk. They were polite, but their presence filled the space in a way that reminded me this was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a federal case. We took an elevator down to a quiet floor where the walls were glass and steel. They guided me into an interview room with a long table, 2 chairs, and a small recorder blinking red. An older agent with a calm, measured voice introduced himself as Agent Carter. He said they appreciated my cooperation and that today was about piecing together the past. The way he said it made the word past feel heavier than usual. He asked me to describe what I remembered of my earliest years. At first, I thought I remembered nothing before Charleston, but as I spoke, fragments surfaced like pebbles rising through water. A park with green benches. A woman's voice humming a song I did not know. A train passing somewhere close. Carter nodded slowly, taking notes. He explained that these fragments were consistent with the original police reports from Central Park in 1997. They played a recording from an old witness statement. A woman had seen a child with a silver bracelet crying near the pond that afternoon. 10 minutes later, the child was gone. The nanny reported being distracted by a stranger asking for directions. It was the same story I had read in Judith's folder, but hearing it aloud from federal agents made it sink in deeper. They showed me a timeline on the screen. Henry and Vivian had traveled to Mexico shortly after that day and returned with falsified adoption papers. They had leveraged connections through a shadow network that operated in the 90s, preying on desperate families and vulnerable children. The evidence had been buried under layers of wealth and influence for decades. What changed everything was the DNA match, the viral video, and the bracelet. Carter's voice was steady as he spoke. "Wealth can hide things, Miss Moreland, but it cannot erase time." I sat still, fingers twisted together in my lap. Every detail he shared pulled another thread from the fabric of the life I thought I had known. Another agent, a woman named Marlowe, entered the room carrying a box of old files. She laid them on the table with quiet precision. Inside were photographs, travel documents, and financial records. Among them was a photo of Henry and Vivian standing at a border checkpoint in 1997, both smiling like people who had nothing to fear. Seeing their faces in those old images made something tighten behind my ribs. Marlowe spoke gently. "We believe Vivian participated, but under his control. We have documentation of his threats, psychological domination. That does not erase what happened, but it paints the full picture. I did not know whether to hate her or pity her. My mother, the woman who brushed my hair at night, had also signed away the truth. The agents told me a witness had recently surfaced in Boston, a retired border clerk who remembered the transaction. Henry had offered cash. Vivian had remained silent. They had walked out with a child and falsified paperwork stamped by a corrupt intermediary. Hearing these details was like standing on shifting ground. I had spent my life building a fragile balance around silence. Now the silence was dissolving piece by piece. Carter leaned forward slightly. "This is not your burden to carry," he said quietly. "But your testimony matters. Your voice can finish what the system failed to do 28 years ago." I took a long breath. I agreed to cooperate fully. Over the next hours, they asked careful questions. Where had Henry taken me as a child? Did he ever speak of Mexico? Did Vivian ever mention anything that did not align with the official story? The memories came in uneven fragments. I remembered Henry telling me that my mother had been sick before he married Vivian. I remembered the way Vivian flinched whenever Henry raised his voice. I remembered the night I asked why I did not have baby photos. He said I should be grateful for the life he gave me. That phrase had seemed normal then. Now it felt like a lock clicking shut. The agents recorded everything. They spoke with patience, but behind their eyes I could see the weight of a case too long ignored. When the interview ended, they walked me through the evidence room. It was cold and quiet. The walls were lined with boxes labeled with dates and numbers. One of those boxes held the file with my name, Lila Archer. I traced the letters with my eyes and felt a surge of anger so sharp it surprised me. Not the helpless kind I had carried for years. This was something different. It was focused, clear. Carter explained the next steps. They were working with the Department of Justice to prepare federal kidnapping charges against Henry Moreland. Vivian would face charges as well, though her role would be evaluated in light of evidence of coercion. The FBI was coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. Because the kidnapping crossed state and national lines, this was federal territory. No amount of money or lawyers could bury it now. I asked how long it would take. Carter said, "Justice takes time, but it never forgets." Those words hung in the air like a promise. I left the building with Judith waiting outside. The snow had stopped, but the air was cold enough to sting the inside of my lungs. For the first time since the gala, I felt a strange kind of clarity. The fear had not disappeared, but it was no longer choking me. Judith walked beside me in silence, letting me absorb everything. I realized this story no longer belonged only to me. It belonged to the little girl taken from a park. It belonged to the mother who had waited. It belonged to the people who had watched Henry's power go unchecked for too long. And now it belonged to the law. That night, I lay in a hotel room overlooking the city lights and replayed Carter's words in my mind. Justice takes time, but it never forgets. In that quiet room with the hum of traffic below, I made myself a promise. The man who took everything from me would face the light he had spent decades hiding from. And this time, there would be witnesses. The air in Charleston carried a strange stillness the morning I returned. The live oaks along the country club road stood motionless, their branches draped in moss like they had been waiting for this day for years. Judith's voice over the phone had been clear. "You do not have to be there, Juliet, but I had to see it. I needed to see the man who had built his power on lies face something bigger than himself." The country club looked almost identical to the night of the gala. The lawn was perfectly trimmed. The brick facade untouched the fountain in front, still spilling clear water like nothing had happened. But something had changed. I could feel it in the way the air pressed against my skin. Cars were lined up along the drive, black SUVs and unmarked sedans mixed with luxury vehicles. Reporters stood near the gate microphones ready, cameras pointed. The press knew. Everyone knew. I parked farther down the street, far enough to stay hidden but close enough to watch. Across the green, Henry stood on the terrace with a glass of water, dressed in his crisp white polo and khaki pants, surrounded by the same circle of wealthy friends who had laughed and toasted him weeks ago. His posture was loose, almost careless, the way it always was when he believed no one could touch him. The FBI agents moved with quiet precision, their windbreakers flashing the block letters across their backs. The sound of radios crackled softly in the cool air. Everything unfolded without drama, almost eerily calm. A black SUV pulled up to the entrance. 2 agents stepped out, followed by local officers. One of them carried a folder tucked under his arm. A warrant. I held my breath as they approached the terrace. For a few seconds, no one noticed them. Henry kept talking, laughing at something a friend said. Then the lead agent spoke his name with the kind of authority that slices through noise like a blade. Henry Moreland. The laughter stopped. His head turned slowly, like he did not quite believe anyone could say his name like that. The agent's voice was steady and clear. "You are under arrest for the federal kidnapping of Lila Eleanor Archer." The words hung in the open air. The terrace erupted in whispers. One man took a step back. Another pulled out his phone to record. It was exactly the same setting where Henry had humiliated me. Same faces, same silence. But this time he was the one standing under the weight of every eye. He blinked once, twice, then started to speak. "There must be a mistake." The agent's voice did not waver. "You have the right to remain silent." As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound carried across the lawn like a gunshot. A gasp rippled through the guests. Some lowered their glasses. Some lifted their phones higher. The same people who had watched me fall apart now filmed him unravel. Vivian stood near the doorway of the club, wearing a pale silk blouse, her hands pressed to her chest. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Chad was beside her, frozen, his jaw tight, as if he could not comprehend what was happening. A camera flash lit the air. Someone shouted a question. Agents guided Henry down the steps with firm hands. He looked around like a man seeing his own kingdom collapse brick by brick. His eyes swept over the crowd, over the people who once feared him, who once clapped for him. Their faces were different now. They were hungry. They were curious. They were not loyal. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. I had seen that expression on others because of him. Seeing it on him was like watching a monument crack. I felt no joy, only a quiet, sharp clarity. The agents moved him toward the SUV. Cameras followed. Reporters shouted questions about the will, about the arrest, about the kidnapping. The questions bled together into a wall of sound. Vivian swayed slightly. 2 officers approached her, but she did not resist. She just lowered her head as they led her away to be questioned. Chad did not move. His world had cracked open in a single morning. The gate was crowded now. Cars honked in the distance. I stood across the street behind a low brick wall, watching through the gaps in the branches. My fingers dug into the rough surface of the brick as Henry turned his head for one last look at the club. For decades, this place had belonged to him. His power had lived in its halls, whispered through its corridors. Now it belonged to the justice system. The agents guided him into the back seat of the SUV. The door shut with a dull thud that seemed louder than anything else. I knew that sound would live in my memory for the rest of my life. People were still recording, phones lifted high. Some of them were the same hands that had held champagne glasses the night he struck me. Now those same hands were capturing his downfall. The symmetry of it made my chest tighten. Judith's car pulled up quietly behind me. She stepped out without a word, just stood beside me as the convoy of black vehicles rolled out of the gates. The crowd shifted like a tide. Someone shouted my name, but I did not answer. I kept my eyes on the car until it disappeared down the tree-lined road. The winter air stung my face, but I did not move. This was the moment I had waited for without knowing I was waiting. The man who had stolen my childhood, who had tried to destroy me publicly, was finally facing something bigger than his wealth. He was facing the truth. I exhaled slowly. The tremor in my hands began to ease. Judith glanced at me. "You did not have to come." "I know," I said quietly, "but I needed to see it." She nodded. We stood there for a long moment, 2 figures at the edge of a crumbling empire. Behind the gate, the guests murmured, already spinning their own versions of the story. But the truth was no longer buried. It was documented. It was federal. It was real. As we walked back toward the car, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been wound tight for decades. It was not joy. It was something deeper. The same people who filmed my pain were now filming his downfall. And for the first time, the silence that had followed me all my life did not feel like a cage. It felt like the beginning of freedom. The federal courthouse in Boston rose like a wall of red brick and glass against the gray winter sky. The morning of the trial, the air was sharp and clean, the kind that bit at the edges of your lungs when you breathed too fast. Reporters clustered behind the barricades, their cameras already aimed at the steps. It had been weeks since the arrest in Charleston, weeks of headlines dissecting every corner of the Moreland name. But now the story had shifted. It was no longer about scandal or whispers at golf clubs. It was about law. I stepped out of the black sedan with Judith at my side. The courthouse steps felt higher than I remembered from the pretrial hearings. Every step I climbed made my heart beat louder. This was the day everything turned from private pain to public record. The hallway inside was quiet, but thick with tension. Federal marshals stood at the doors, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. A clerk directed us toward the courtroom. The double doors loomed like something I had spent my entire life walking toward without knowing. Inside the gallery, rows of benches were already full. Journalists, legal observers, former acquaintances from Charleston, and strangers who had followed the case gathered in silence. At the defense table sat Henry Moreland. His hair was perfectly combed, his suit immaculate, but his hands were cuffed. Even through the layers of polish, there was something brittle in the way he sat. Vivian sat beside him. Her once perfect posture was slumped, her pale blue dress hanging loosely like it belonged to someone else. She clutched a tissue in one hand, eyes fixed on the table. Chad was not in the room. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The sound of the gavel landing echoed like a hammer against glass. I sat beside Judith, hands resting on the table, breathing slowly. The prosecution opened with a timeline so clean it cut through the quiet like a scalpel. The abduction from Central Park, the falsified adoption documents in Mexico, the entry into Charleston society. Every detail was laid out with precision, years of secrets stripped down to evidence and testimony. A federal agent walked the court through the chain of custody for the DNA tests. Another showed photographs from the original investigation. Each image was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The bracelet appeared on the overhead screen, a close-up of its delicate silver surface. My breath caught. It looked smaller on the screen, but that little train etched into it had carried my entire life in silence. The prosecutor's voice was steady. This is the same bracelet identified in a missing child report from 1997. This is the same bracelet seen on video during the Charleston Gala last month. This bracelet is the key piece that broke the silence. Henry shifted in his chair. His lawyer leaned close to him, whispering something, but he barely moved. He had built his life on control. Here he had none. When it was my turn to testify, I stood slowly, my heels clicking softly against the floor. Walking to the witness stand felt like stepping into a storm I had avoided for decades. I took the oath. My voice did not shake. The prosecutor asked me to state my name. I said it without hesitation. Lila Eleanor Archer. The room fell silent in a way that did not need to be asked for. I could feel every gaze fixed on me, but for once I was not shrinking beneath it. The prosecutor asked me to describe my life under Henry's control. I began with the gala, with the sting of his hand against my face, with the humiliation that followed. Then I told them about the years before that night, how every decision in my life had been shaped by his voice, the school he chose, the career he approved of, the silence he expected. As I spoke, I saw Henry's jaw tighten. Vivian kept her head down. When the prosecutor held up the bracelet again, I explained how he told me it was a family heirloom. I explained how that was a lie. I explained how that tiny piece of silver became the key that unlocked the truth. The courtroom did not erupt. It inhaled. Quietly. Slowly. The judge watched closely. The defense tried to paint a picture of a man who had provided a privileged life. They said I had been cared for, not harmed. But every word they spoke only made the evidence heavier. This was not about privilege. This was about theft. It was about a name stolen, a childhood stolen, a life rewritten without consent. As the first day of testimony drew toward lunch break, the prosecution called the FBI agent to the stand. Carter spoke with the same measured calm I remembered from that cold morning in Boston. He laid out the investigation step by step, from the viral video to the reopened case file to the border clerk's testimony. Every sentence landed with weight. He described the network Henry had used. He described how Vivian had signed the papers but had lived under threats for decades. He described how my DNA had matched the Archer file. I watched Henry as Carter spoke. His shoulders slowly sank. His control dissolved not in a burst of drama, but in the slow erosion of certainty. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was growing, but inside the air was thick and still. When the judge called for recess, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor seemed too loud. I walked out slowly, my chest tight, but my spine straight. For the first time, I was not carrying their lies. I was speaking my truth, and the system was listening. When the afternoon session began, the light through the tall courtroom windows had shifted to a muted gold, casting long shadows across the floor. The gallery filled again, a low murmur settling into silence when the judge returned to the bench. This time, it was Vivian's turn. Her attorney guided her to the witness stand with careful steps. She looked fragile, a ghost of the woman who once commanded every gala with a smile. Her hands trembled as she took the oath. For years, I had imagined what it would be like to hear her speak the truth. I thought it would sound cold or defiant. Instead, it sounded like something breaking. She admitted to signing the papers in Mexico. She admitted to staying silent. She admitted that Henry had controlled every part of her life from the moment she met him. She said she had wanted a child more than anything, and when Henry offered me to her, she believed it was legal until it was too late to turn back. Her voice shook as she said she chose silence out of fear. She said she told herself the lie so many times it became easier to believe than the truth. As she spoke, tears streaked the sides of her face. Some in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Henry kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, expression tight, like a man refusing to admit gravity exists, even as the floor gives way beneath him. The prosecutor cross-examined her gently but firmly, reminding her of every choice, every signature, every moment she could have spoken and did not. Her answers came haltingly, almost whispered. The judge's gaze was steady. When she stepped down, she did not look at me. She stared at the floor as if the weight of her silence had finally settled on her shoulders. Then it was Henry's turn. His lawyer advised against testifying, but Henry was a man who had lived his entire life believing his voice was stronger than truth. He walked to the stand with the same stiff confidence he had once worn at the head of every table. But here it was different. There was no champagne, no applause. Only a judge, a jury, and the quiet certainty of evidence. His voice was smooth at first. He spoke of sacrifice, of providing, of shaping me into a woman of refinement. He spoke like the world owed him gratitude. The prosecutor let him talk just long enough for the mask to settle on his face before tearing it away. They asked why he had flown to Mexico, why the adoption papers were forged, why there were payments to a known intermediary, why he never registered the adoption in the United States. His answers twisted like a man trying to build a wall out of smoke. He blamed Vivian. He blamed paperwork. He blamed timing. He blamed everything except himself. Then the prosecutor held up the bracelet again. The silver glinted beneath the lights. They asked one question. "Did you give her this?" He said yes. "Did you tell her it was a family heirloom?" He said yes. "Did you know this bracelet belonged to a missing child reported in New York in 1997? He hesitated. The silence that followed was deafening. The judge leaned forward slightly, watching. He finally whispered yes. That whisper was louder than his shouts had ever been. The prosecutor pressed harder. "You did not adopt her. You took her. And for 28 years you kept her quiet. You built your world on a stolen child." For the first time, Henry's voice cracked. He shouted about how he had given me everything, how I should be grateful. But it was not power anymore. It was noise. The jury watched. The judge struck the gavel once, and his words died in the air. When he stepped down from the stand, his shoulders were not square. His chin was not raised. He was just a man in a suit who had finally run out of lies. The closing statements were short and sharp. The prosecution spoke of a child taken and a woman silenced. They spoke of justice delayed but not denied. The defense tried to soften the edges, but nothing could blunt the weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the room was so quiet I could hear the soft tick of the clock above the bench. The foreperson stood. "On the count of federal kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty." Each word landed like a door closing. Henry did not move. Vivian covered her face. The judge thanked the jury and set the sentencing date. The gavel struck one last time. It was over. Reporters rushed outside. Flashes exploded against the evening sky. But inside the courtroom, I sat perfectly still. For 28 years, I had been their secret. That day, I became their sentence. I walked down the courthouse steps as the cold Boston air swept through my hair. People shouted my name, cameras flashed, but I barely heard them. The weight that had pressed on my chest my entire life had shifted. It was not gone, but it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the record, to the law, to history. And for the first time, my name was mine again. The sentencing took place 3 weeks after the verdict, and by then the winter sun in Boston had turned pale and unforgiving. The courtroom was quieter this time, as if even the walls had absorbed the story. Henry Moreland stood at the defense table with none of the polish he once carried. His hands were still cuffed, his posture stiff, but the arrogance that had once filled the air around him was gone. Vivian sat beside him, small and tired, a pale shadow of the woman who once ruled social events with poise. The judge read the sentence slowly, each word carved into the room like a stone placed on a monument. Henry Moreland was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Vivian Moreland received 20 years with the possibility of early release under cooperation agreements. The courtroom stayed silent. No gasps, no applause, just the weight of a chapter closing. I sat behind the prosecution table with Judith. When the judge asked if the victim wished to speak, I stood. My voice was steady. I told the court that this was not about revenge. It was about giving a name back to the girl who had lost it. It was about making sure that silence would not be the last chapter of this story. When I returned to my seat, I did not look at Henry. I did not need to. For the first time in my life, his gaze no longer had power. The days that followed felt strange, like standing in the quiet after a storm. Headlines across the country spoke of the trial of the kidnapping of the fall of the Moreland family. But in Charleston, the city moved on with a kind of quiet curiosity. The house where I had grown up was seized as part of the investigation. The trust that had been tied to Henry's empire was dismantled. Chad left the city, and I did not hear from him again. Reporters tried to follow me, but their interest faded as new stories took their place. What remained was not noise. It was space. I changed my name legally. On the day the court papers came through, I stood in front of the mirror in my small temporary apartment in Boston and whispered it out loud. Lila Eleanor Archer. My name. It felt unfamiliar and familiar all at once, like returning to a house that had always belonged to me, even though I had not lived in it for decades. I decided not to stay in Boston. New York had been the place of my lost Charleston, the place of my silence. But I did not want to be defined by either. Still, something about Charleston called me back. Not the house, not the city's polished facades, but the quiet along the water, the way the wind moved through the marshes, the way the sea always whispered like it remembered everything. When I returned, the country club, that had once been the epicenter of my humiliation and Henry's power, was still standing, but the whispers were different now. People looked at me with curiosity, some with pity, some with quiet respect, but their gaze no longer held me hostage. I bought a small house on the outskirts near the shoreline, nothing like the estate I grew up in. It was quiet and filled with light. For the first time, I chose something for myself. Every morning I opened the windows and let the wind move through the rooms. It smelled like salt and clean air, like a new beginning. But I did not want to disappear into comfort. I wanted to build something that mattered. Judith helped me navigate the complex legal web of restitution and inheritance. Henry's empire stripped down still held assets, and the Archer family had their own resources. James stood by me through every decision, never pushing, only steady. I told him I wanted to create something that made silence less lonely for others like me. That was how Lila's Haven began, just an idea whispered across a kitchen table at night. A center for survivors of domestic violence and family control, a place where silence could turn into strength. We found an old historic building near the waterfront, its brick walls weathered but strong. Renovation took months. Each day, the workers peeled away the dust and layers of neglect, and beneath it all, a beautiful structure emerged, solid and resilient. It felt fitting. I walked through the halls often while it was still empty, imagining the voices that would fill it not with fear, but with stories. When the glass case arrived, I placed the bracelet inside it myself. The tiny silver train glimmered softly in the afternoon light. For so long, it had been a symbol of everything stolen from me. Now it stood as proof that stolen things can be reclaimed, that silence can be broken. It was the first object to be placed in the lobby of Lila's Haven. It would not be the last. The opening day drew people from across the city. Reporters came again, but this time I did not feel like prey. Survivors came too. Women and men who carried their own silent histories. Some approached me quietly, their voices soft, telling me they saw the trial, telling me they felt less alone because of it. I listened to every word. I knew their silence because it had once been mine. As the sun set over the water that evening, the building filled with a warmth I had never known growing up in the cold marble halls of the Moreland house. This was not a house built on power. It was built on truth. It was built on survival. It was built on a name that was finally mine. The weeks after the opening of Lila's Haven moved quietly without the roar of headlines or the sharp edge of courtroom lights. I spent my mornings walking along the shore near the center, the salt air filling my lungs in a way that felt different from any breath I had taken before. The house on the coast had become a sanctuary, Not because it was grand, but because it was mine. I filled it slowly, deliberately. A chair here, a painting there. No heavy furniture carved by Henry's taste. No mirrors polished to reflect someone else's expectations. Just space and light and silence that belonged to me. James visited often. We sat on the porch watching the sun sink over the water. He never tried to fill the silence. He just shared it. One evening he brought a small wooden box. It was old, carefully preserved. Inside were letters from my mother written over the years she had been searching for me. I opened the first one slowly. Her handwriting curled softly across the page. She wrote about the sound of trains, about birthdays she celebrated without me, about how she never stopped believing that I was alive. The words blurred as I read them. She had left pieces of herself scattered across time, hoping one day I would find them. Now here they were, resting in my hands like something fragile but alive. I kept the box on my bedside table after that. It reminded me of a truth, bigger than the lies I had grown up with. I spent my days at the center listening to stories from people who had lived through their own quiet wars. Each story was different, but the silence they carried was familiar. It was the same silence that had followed me for 36 years. It was the kind that wrapped itself around your ribs and told you not to speak. One woman handed me a folded piece of paper during a workshop. On it, she had written, "Thank you for proving silence can end." I folded it carefully and kept it in my wallet. I never wanted to forget what it felt like to see someone else stand a little taller because I had spoken. The old me would have thought freedom would feel loud, like fireworks. It did not. It felt like standing in the sunlight without looking over my shoulder. It felt like walking through a door I had once believed was locked. It felt like calling myself Lila and knowing it meant something real. Henry's sentencing remained a headline for a few days before the world moved on. Vivian's plea for early release was years away. Chad stayed gone. For once, their names no longer shaped the edges of my life. I let them fade like distant noise. What remained was the steady rhythm of waves against the shore, the low hum of people finding their voices inside the center, the quiet sound of my own footsteps. I visited New York once that spring. James took me to the house where my nursery had been. He opened the door to the room and I stepped inside. It was smaller than I remembered in flashes, but warm. The yellow paint on the walls was still there, faded but steady. On a shelf sat a line of small wooden trains. He had kept them. Every year he had added one. I reached out and touched the last one, the one placed the year I disappeared. For the first time, I felt the weight of the past and it did not crush me. It steadied me. We stood in the room together, not as strangers bound by tragedy, but as father and daughter. That night when I returned to Charleston, I walked barefoot along the sand in front of my house. The ocean stretched wide and dark, its surface glimmering under the moon. I closed my eyes and breathed in the night air. No guards, no marble walls, no man's voice dictating my worth. Just me, the woman I had become, the girl I had found again. I thought of the people watching my story, the ones who had sent letters, comments, messages, survivors, witnesses, strangers. Their voices formed something bigger than my own. It was not just my story anymore. It was theirs, too. I turned back to the house light spilling softly from the windows. The bracelet was still in its glass case at the center, but I no longer needed to touch it to know who I was. My name was not tied to a family built on silence. It belonged to me, and as the waves rolled in, I whispered to the night a promise that was not for Henry or Vivian or the past. It was for me. If silence could shape a life, then truth could rebuild it. I am Lila Eleanor Archer, and I am finally free. If you believe silence is not safety but survival, share this story. Where are you watching from?